The glass in Claire Whitfield's hand trembled for only a second before she set it down without a sound. Around the long oak table, laughter rippled through the room, warm and easy, the kind of laughter that comes from people who have never once worried about being the subject of a joke. Daniel Hartley leaned back in his chair. A proud grin spread across his face, his arm draped over the back of his seat as if he owned the moment as completely as he owned the room. He had just finished a sentence that would end everything, though he did not know it yet. "She's brilliant with numbers," Daniel had said to Edmund Whitmore, the silver-haired investor seated across from him. "But let's be honest, she's not exactly the type you'd put on a magazine cover." He laughed at his own words, and the table laughed with him, his mother Margaret pressing a napkin to her lips to hide her smile, his father Gerald chuckling into his wine glass. "Lucky for her, I don't need a wife who turns heads. I need one who balances the books." Claire sat perfectly still. She did not flinch, did not blush, did not do any of the things a woman is expected to do when she has just been humiliated in front of a room full of people who matter to her husband's business. She simply folded her napkin, placed it beside her untouched plate, and looked at Edmund Whitmore with a calm, steady gaze that made the older man shift slightly in his seat. Nobody at that table understood what they had just witnessed. They thought they had watched a husband make a light-hearted joke about his wife. What they had actually watched was the final page of a book closing. Claire had heard worse things said about her before. She had heard them from Daniel's mother, who often reminded her that she was plain but practical. She had heard them from Daniel's college friends, who assumed she had married into money rather than helped build it. She had even heard variations of it from Daniel himself, in private, in tones that were softer but no less cutting. But something about tonight was different. Tonight, the insult had a purpose. Tonight, he had used her, her appearance, her worth as a human being, as a punchline to charm an investor into feeling comfortable, into feeling superior, into feeling like Daniel Hartley was a man in complete control of his household and his company. What Daniel did not know, what none of them knew, was that Claire Whitfield was the only person in that room who actually understood how Hartley Freight Solutions worked. She was the one who had spent the last 6 years quietly holding the company together, long after the accountants they hired had failed, long after the bank had threatened to call in their loans, long after Daniel had nearly lost everything his father built. She had done it not for recognition, not for a salary, not even really for gratitude. She had done it because she loved this family once, and because she believed, foolishly, that her work would eventually be seen. Tonight she understood that it never would be. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. Edmund Whitmore asked polite questions about quarterly growth projections, and Daniel answered them with confidence, occasionally glancing toward Claire for confirmation of a number, a date, a figure, as though she were a calculator he kept nearby for convenience. Each time he looked at her, she answered clearly and precisely, her voice never wavering, her expression never changing. She gave him every number he needed. She would not embarrass him in front of an investor, not tonight. That was not who she was, but she was taking note quietly of everything. She noticed how Gerald Hartley refilled Edmund's wine glass before his own, a gesture of respect reserved only for men whose money mattered. She noticed how Margaret asked Edmund about his golf handicap, but never once asked Claire how her week had gone. She noticed the way the entire family orbited around Daniel, adjusting themselves to his moods, his jokes, his comfort, while she remained invisible except when useful. When dessert arrived, a lemon tart that Margaret had specifically requested because Edmund liked citrus, Claire excused herself politely to use the powder room. She walked calmly down the hallway, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, past the framed photographs of Hartley family milestones, anniversaries, company openings, award ceremonies. She stopped in front of one photograph in particular, taken 5 years earlier, the day the company secured the loan that saved it from collapse. Daniel stood in the center, shaking hands with the bank manager, flashing his brightest smile for the camera. Claire stood at the edge of the frame, barely visible, holding the folder of financial documents she had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing. She had cropped herself out of her own life so many times that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to stand in the center of a photograph. In the quiet of the powder room, Claire looked at her reflection in the mirror. She studied her own face carefully, the lines beginning to form near her eyes from years of squinting at spreadsheets late into the night, the slight furrow between her brows that had become permanent from stress she never spoke about, the tired but steady eyes of a woman who had given everything she had to a marriage and a business that no longer saw her as a person. She did not see an unattractive woman staring back. She saw a woman who had been undervalued for far too long, and who had just been given, in the cruelest possible way, absolute clarity. She thought about the moment Daniel had said those words. She thought about the way the table had laughed. She thought about how none of them, not one single person in that room, had thought to ask what she actually did every single day to keep their world from falling apart. They assumed the company simply worked because Daniel was talented, because Gerald had built a strong foundation, because luck had always favored the Hartley name. Nobody understood that behind every closed deal, every satisfied client, every payroll that went out on time, there was a woman working quietly in a small office upstairs, untangling problems that would have destroyed the company years ago if left in anyone else's hands. Claire splashed cold water on her wrists, a habit she had picked up during the most stressful years of managing the company's finances, a small trick to keep herself calm and clear-headed. Tonight, the water felt different against her skin. It did not feel like she was calming herself down. It felt like she was washing something away. When she returned to the table, dessert had been served and the conversation had moved on to safer topics: the weather, an upcoming charity gala, a mutual acquaintance's recent divorce discussed in hushed, judgmental tones. Claire sat back down and picked up her spoon, tasting the lemon tart without really tasting it at all. Her mind was somewhere else entirely, running through numbers, dates, accounts, passwords, all the invisible architecture of a business that existed almost entirely inside her head, and on a private laptop that no one else in the family had ever bothered to ask about. Edmund Whitmore, perhaps sensing something in the shift of the room's energy, turned to Claire directly for the first time all evening. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, his tone genuinely curious, "Daniel tells me you handle the books. What exactly does that involve, if you don't mind me asking?" For a brief moment, the table went quiet, as though the question itself was somehow inappropriate, as though Claire's work was a subject better left undiscussed in polite company. Daniel opened his mouth to answer for her, the way he always did, but Claire spoke first. "I manage every financial account the company holds," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough weight to fill the silence. "Payroll, vendor contracts, tax filings, the loan restructuring 5 years ago, the current negotiations with your firm. I built the reporting system Daniel used in his presentation to you last month. I am, in most practical terms, the financial backbone of this company." Nobody laughed this time. Edmund studied her with new interest, a slow recalculation happening behind his eyes. Daniel's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered quickly, adding something about how they made a great team, how she was too modest to admit how much she did, how lucky he was to have found someone so capable. But the words came out slightly too fast, slightly too defensive, and Claire noticed, for the first time that night, a flicker of something in her husband's expression that looked almost like fear. He had spent years assuming her competence was simply background noise, a quiet hum that kept his business running without ever needing his attention or his gratitude. He had never once considered what would happen if that hum simply stopped. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of polite conversation Claire barely registered. She smiled when appropriate. She answered when spoken to. She played the role she had played for 6 years, the supportive wife, the quiet asset, the woman who made everything work without ever asking for credit. But inside, a decision was already forming, cold and precise, the way all of her best decisions had always formed, not in a moment of anger, but in a moment of absolute clarity. When the guests finally left, Edmund shaking Daniel's hand warmly at the door, praising the wonderful evening, the impressive financial team behind Hartley Freight Solutions, Daniel turned to Claire with a satisfied smile, completely unaware that anything had changed. "That went well," he said, loosening his tie. Edmund seemed impressed. "Good thing you knew your numbers tonight. Claire looked at him for a long moment, studying the face of a man she had once loved deeply, a man who had once looked at her like she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, before success and comfort had slowly worn that admiration down into something closer to convenience. "Yes," she said quietly. "Good thing." She turned and walked upstairs, leaving Daniel standing in the hallway, humming to himself as he checked his phone, already moving on to the next thing, already forgetting the words he had said at dinner, already certain that tomorrow would be exactly like every day before it. He had no idea that upstairs, in the small office that had always been hers and hers alone, Claire Whitfield was opening her laptop for what would become the longest night of her life. And he had absolutely no idea that by the time the sun rose over their quiet suburban street, the woman he had called unattractive in front of an investor, the woman he had underestimated for 6 long years, would be gone, taking with her every ledger, every password, every piece of financial knowledge that kept his entire world standing upright. The house was silent, except for the soft click of computer keys. Claire had built this company's financial systems from nothing. She had memorized every account number, every vendor relationship, every quiet compromise that had kept Hartley Freight Solutions alive during years. The family never fully understood how close they had come to losing everything. She had done this work in silence in the margins of her own life, believing that eventually, somehow, someone would notice. Tonight had taught her with brutal finality that no one ever would. She began methodically the way she approached everything to make a list. Not a list of grievances, though she had plenty. A list of assets. A list of access points. A list of everything that existed only in her hands and nowhere else. By midnight, the list had grown longer than she expected. By 2 in the morning, she understood something that would change the course of everything that followed. She was not simply an employee of this family's business. She was its foundation. And foundations, unlike the people who stand on top of them, can choose to walk away. Outside, the neighborhood slept peacefully, unaware of the quiet revolution taking place behind the curtained windows of the Hartley household. Inside, Claire Whitfield worked through the night with the same discipline she had always brought to her work, except this time, for the first time in 6 years, every hour she spent was entirely for herself. The sun would rise in a few hours, and when it did, everything would be different. 7 years earlier, Claire Whitfield had walked into Hartley Freight Solutions not as a wife, but as a temporary bookkeeper hired for 3 months to help sort out a mess of unpaid invoices. She had answered a newspaper advertisement that promised steady hours and simple work. What she found instead was a company drowning quietly beneath the surface of its own optimism. Gerald Hartley had built the business 20 years earlier with nothing but a single delivery truck and a stubborn belief that hard work solved every problem. For a while it had. But by the time Claire arrived, Gerald had already begun handing the daily operations over to his son Daniel, a charming, energetic young man who understood sales, understood clients, understood how to walk into a room and make people believe in him within minutes. What Daniel did not understand, and had never bothered to learn, was how money actually moved through a company once the handshake was over and the contract was signed. On her first day, Claire was handed 3 overflowing boxes of receipts, invoices, and unopened bank statements, along with a brief, almost apologetic explanation from the previous bookkeeper, an older woman named Patricia who was retiring after 20 years and clearly relieved to be leaving. "Good luck," Patricia had said, not unkindly, before walking out the door for the final time. "Nobody here has looked at these numbers properly in over a year." Claire spent her first week simply sorting. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She sat in a small, windowless office at the back of the building, surrounded by paper, and began the slow, patient work of understanding exactly how much trouble the company was actually in. What she discovered by the end of that first month terrified her, though she kept her composure and said nothing to anyone outside the finance office. Hartley Freight Solutions was 3 months behind on payments to 2 of its largest fuel suppliers. It had quietly missed a tax filing deadline the previous year, a mistake that had already accrued significant penalties. Worse, the company's largest client, a regional distribution chain that accounted for nearly 40% of total revenue, was 2 invoices away from terminating their contract due to repeated late deliveries caused by unpaid vehicle maintenance bills. The company was not simply struggling. It was weeks away from collapse, and almost no one inside it seemed to fully understand how close the edge really was. Claire brought her findings to Gerald first, laying out a simple, organized report on his desk, expecting him to take immediate action. Instead, Gerald waved a dismissive hand and told her, with the confidence of a man who had survived difficult years before, that these things always sorted themselves out eventually. "We've had rough patches before," he said. "The business always bounces back. Don't worry yourself over it." Daniel's reaction was different, though not necessarily more helpful. He listened to Claire's report with genuine concern, his charm momentarily replaced by real worry, and asked her directly, "What do we do?" It was the first time anyone at Hartley Freight Solutions had asked Claire for a solution, instead of simply expecting one to appear on its own. She had not expected to feel the way she did in that moment, a quiet, unfamiliar warmth at being seen, being needed, being trusted with something that actually mattered. She did not know then that this feeling, the feeling of being useful to Daniel Hartley, would come to define 6 years of her life. Claire spent the following weeks building, from scratch, a financial system the company had never had. She created a proper ledger, tracking every incoming and outgoing dollar with a precision the business had never known. She negotiated directly with the fuel suppliers, offering a structured repayment plan that kept deliveries running while slowly closing the gap. She personally called the tax office, spending hours on hold, eventually arranging a manageable payment plan for the penalties that had accrued. And she flew, alone, to meet with the regional distribution chain's operations manager, armed with nothing but a folder of honest numbers and a promise that things would change. The distribution chain stayed. The suppliers were paid. The tax penalties were resolved. Within 4 months, Claire Whitfield, a temporary bookkeeper hired for 3 months of simple work, had quietly saved Hartley Freight Solutions from collapse, and almost nobody outside the finance office knew how close the company had come to disaster. Daniel began spending more time with her after that, at first professionally, discussing numbers and strategy over long working lunches, and later, personally, drawn to a woman who understood him and his business in a way no one else ever had. Claire found herself falling for him slowly, not because of his charm, which she had already seen used strategically on clients and investors alike, but because of the rare moments when he dropped that charm entirely and spoke to her honestly, admitting his fears about living up to his father's legacy, his doubts about whether he was truly capable of running the company alone. She married him 2 years later, in a small ceremony that Gerald and Margaret insisted on keeping modest, despite the company's growing success, a decision Claire understood at the time as practical, but would later recognize as the first quiet sign of how the family truly viewed her, useful but not quite worthy of celebration. The years that followed blurred together in a steady rhythm of work. Claire officially became the company's head of finance, though her title on paper never quite matched the scope of what she actually did. She restructured the company's entire accounting system, migrating decades of paper records into a secure digital ledger that only she fully understood how to operate. She negotiated every major loan, every equipment lease, every insurance policy. When the company faced its most dangerous moment 3 years into her marriage, a sudden and severe cash flow crisis caused by a client's bankruptcy that left Hartley Freight Solutions owed an enormous sum with no clear path to recovery, it was Claire who personally guaranteed a critical loan using assets from her own name, a decision she made quietly, without fanfare, simply because she could not watch the company Daniel loved collapse when she had the means to prevent it. Daniel never fully understood the weight of what she had done that year. He knew, vaguely, that Claire had helped sort out the loan situation, but he did not know the details, did not know that her name was legally bound to a debt that could have ruined her financially if the company had failed. He accepted her help the way one accepts good weather, gratefully in the moment, but without ever pausing to consider how fragile the arrangement truly was, or how much risk she had personally absorbed on his behalf. This pattern repeated itself again and again over the following years. A late payment crisis, resolved quietly by Claire working through the night. A client dispute that threatened a major contract, settled through Claire's careful negotiation. A tax audit that could have exposed years of sloppy record-keeping from before her arrival, handled entirely by Claire, who spent 3 weeks preparing documentation so thorough that the auditor left with nothing but praise for the company's financial practices. Each time the crisis passed, each time life at Hartley Freight Solutions returned to its comfortable rhythm, and each time the credit for stability quietly settled onto Daniel's shoulders, the natural assumption of everyone around him, family, clients, investors, that a successful business meant a capable leader, and that the quiet woman working upstairs was simply part of the machinery that made his success possible, rather than the reason it existed at all. Claire did not resent this arrangement at first, or at least she told herself she did not. She found genuine satisfaction in the work itself, in solving problems no one else could see, in being the calm, steady force that kept everything from falling apart. She told herself that recognition did not matter as much as impact, that she did not need applause for work she found meaningful. But somewhere in the quiet accumulation of years, unnoticed dinners where Daniel took full credit for decisions she had made, unspoken assumptions from Margaret that Claire's work was simply helping out, rather than running the company's entire financial operation. Small comments from Gerald that suggested her contributions were appreciated but never quite essential. Something inside her had begun to change. She began keeping a second set of records, separate from the company's official systems. A private ledger of her own creation stored on a personal laptop that no one else in the family had ever asked to see. At first it was simply practical, a backup system in case the company's servers ever failed. But over time it became something more, a quiet, private record of everything Claire had built, everything she had saved, everything that existed because of her hands and her mind alone. It became, without her fully realizing it at the time, an insurance policy against a day she could not yet imagine but somehow, on some level, always knew might come. That day had arrived tonight, at a dinner table, in front of an investor, in the form of a careless joke about her appearance that revealed, with painful clarity, exactly how little the years of sacrifice had actually mattered to the people she had given them to. Sitting alone in her office in the middle of the night, Claire opened that private ledger for the first time in months. She scrolled through years of entries, watching the story of her own quiet devotion unfold across countless spreadsheets and notes, watching the invisible architecture of a company that existed because she had willed it to exist, again and again, through crisis after crisis, while the people who benefited most from her work never once thought to ask what it cost her. She thought about the loan she had personally guaranteed, still not fully repaid, still legally tied to her name. She thought about the tax filings only she knew how to access. She thought about the client relationships she had built and maintained through years of careful, patient communication, relationships that existed in her contacts, her emails, her memory, and nowhere else. She thought about passwords, account access, vendor negotiations, insurance policies, every single thread of the company's financial existence, all of it running through her hands like water through a narrow channel that no one else had ever bothered to locate. And then, with the same calm precision she brought to every difficult decision, Claire began to understand exactly what she needed to do. She was not simply the woman who had been called unattractive at a dinner table. She was the woman who had built an entire company's survival from nothing, quietly, patiently, without ever asking for the credit she deserved. And she was done, finally and completely, waiting for someone else to notice. The clock on her office wall read 3:30 in the morning. Outside, the world remained dark and still, unaware that in a small office above a quiet suburban street, a woman who had spent 6 years making herself invisible was finally, deliberately, choosing to be seen. Claire made a pot of coffee she barely touched and returned to her desk, the private ledger open on one screen, the company's shared drive open on another. She had access to nearly everything, an accumulated privilege built over years of being the only person willing to do the unglamorous work of keeping records accurate. Tonight, that access felt less like a privilege and more like a key she had earned the hard way, a key she intended to use fully before the sun rose. She began with the due diligence file Edmund Whitmore's team had requested 2 weeks earlier, a thick digital folder containing everything a serious investor needed before committing real money to a company: financial statements, client contracts, insurance records, ownership structures. Claire had assembled most of the folder herself, working late nights to present the company in the clearest, most honest light possible. She had done this willingly, believing that a strong investment from Edmund would finally stabilize the company for good, would finally give Daniel the security he had chased for years. What she found buried near the bottom of the folder, in a subfolder Daniel had clearly added himself without asking for her help, stopped her cold. It was a draft document, unfinished, titled simply Ownership Restructuring Proposal. Claire opened it with a strange, sinking sensation in her chest, the kind of feeling that comes when instinct arrives a fraction of a second before understanding. The document outlined a plan, still in early stages, to formally restructure Hartley Freight Solutions ahead of Edmund's investment, converting the company from a family partnership into a corporate entity with clearly defined shareholders. Claire scrolled through the proposed shareholder list slowly. Gerald Hartley, Margaret Hartley, Daniel Hartley. Her name was nowhere on the page. She read it 3 times, certain she had missed something, certain there was another document, an addendum, a footnote explaining her absence. There was none. According to the draft proposal her own husband had been quietly developing, in preparation for a deal she had personally helped negotiate, Claire Whitfield held no formal ownership stake in the company she had spent 6 years rebuilding, protecting, and on at least one occasion, personally financing with her own guaranteed loan. She sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, feeling something settle inside her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but something colder and more clarifying than either. She was not naive. She had always known, on some level, that her role in the company existed in a strange, undefined space, neither fully an employee with a contract nor fully a partner with equity, simply Daniel's wife who helps with the books, a description that had always felt slightly diminishing, but which she had never truly examined until this moment. Now, reading the proposal in black and white, she understood exactly what that undefined space had always meant. It meant that everything she had built could be, and apparently was being, quietly restructured without her, positioned to exist entirely without acknowledging her contribution the moment it became convenient to do so. Claire opened the document's file history, a habit born from years of careful record-keeping, and traced when it had been created. The timestamp read 3 weeks earlier, roughly around the time Edmund Whitmore's team had first expressed serious interest in investing. She checked the file's edit history further and found several revisions, each one refining the same basic structure: Gerald, Margaret, and Daniel as shareholders, no mention of Claire anywhere in any version. She thought about the loan she had personally guaranteed years earlier, still not fully repaid, still legally binding her to a debt tied to a company that, according to this document, did not consider her an owner. She thought about the years of unpaid labor she had contributed, work that any other company would have compensated with a title, a salary commensurate with her responsibilities, or genuine equity. She had accepted none of these things because she had believed, foolishly it now seemed, that her contribution was understood, valued, secure simply because she was family. Tonight had taught her, in layers, exactly how mistaken that belief had been. Claire closed the ownership document and sat quietly for several minutes, allowing herself the rare luxury of simply feeling the full weight of what she had discovered, before returning, methodically, to the work in front of her. She had built a life around discipline, around the belief that emotion, however valid, should never interfere with clear thinking during a crisis. Tonight was, without question, a crisis, though not the kind anyone else in her life yet understood. She began cataloging, item by item, everything that existed solely within her knowledge and access. The list, which had felt substantial hours earlier, now revealed itself to be even larger than she had first realized. She controlled the master password to the company's primary banking portal, changed only by her, known only to her, required for every significant financial transaction the company made. She controlled access to the payroll system, having personally migrated it to a more secure platform 2 years earlier after a minor security scare that Daniel had barely registered as important. She held the only complete, organized record of every vendor contract, many of which existed only in her personal files after years of consolidating scattered paperwork the company had never properly maintained. She was the sole point of contact for the company's insurance broker, the tax accountant they occasionally consulted, and the loan officer who had processed the critical guarantee years earlier. She held relationships, built carefully over years, with 3 of the company's 5 largest clients, relationships maintained through her direct, personal communication rather than any formal company channel. Daniel could charm a room. Daniel could close a deal with a handshake and a smile. But Daniel did not know how to access the company's own banking portal without her guidance. He did not know which vendor contracts were expiring in the coming month. He did not know the specific terms of the loan that had saved the company years earlier, a loan bearing her name as guarantor, a detail she suspected he had genuinely forgotten in the comfortable years since the crisis had passed. Claire opened a blank document and began writing, not a resignation letter, not yet, but something more practical, more essential. She began writing a complete accounting of everything that existed only in her hands, a map of the company's true financial architecture, information that had never been properly documented anywhere else because she had always been the documentation, the living system that made everything function. As she worked, she found herself returning, again and again, to the ownership proposal she had discovered, turning it over in her mind from different angles. Had Daniel simply forgotten to include her, a careless oversight born from years of taking her contributions for granted? Or had the omission been deliberate, a quiet decision to formalize what tonight's comment at dinner had made painfully explicit? That in Daniel's mind, and perhaps in the minds of his entire family, Claire's value existed only in her usefulness, never in her ownership, never in genuine partnership. She did not know the answer. And as the night stretched toward its darkest hours, she realized the answer did not actually matter. Whether Daniel had forgotten her out of thoughtlessness or excluded her deliberately, the result was identical, a document that erased 6 years of her life as though they had never happened. Claire opened her email and began searching through years of old messages, a habit she rarely indulged but which felt necessary tonight, a way of confirming what her instincts already understood. She found emails from Edmund Whitmore's due diligence team, addressed almost exclusively to Daniel, occasionally copying Gerald, never once addressed directly to her despite the fact that she had prepared nearly every document they referenced. She found emails from vendors and clients, many of them CCing Daniel on threads she had personally initiated and managed from start to finish. A subtle but consistent pattern of Daniel positioned at the center of communications she had actually authored. She found, buried in an email from 8 months earlier, a message from Margaret to Daniel, accidentally sent to Claire's address as well due to an old email chain, that read simply, "Once the investment closes and things stabilize, we should really discuss bringing in a proper CFO, someone with real credentials, don't you think? No offense to Claire, of course, but the company deserves someone with a title that matches the responsibility." Claire read the message twice, a small, bitter laugh escaping her in the empty office, the first sound she had made all night that was not the quiet click of a keyboard. Someone with real credentials. As though the credentials that mattered were not the 6 years of successfully preventing the company's collapse, were not the loan she had personally guaranteed, were not the relationships she had built and the crises she had solved, one after another, in near total silence. She closed her email and sat very still for a long moment, watching the numbers on her computer clock shift toward 4 in the morning, watching the darkness outside her window remain unbroken, patient, indifferent to the quiet revolution taking place inside this small office. Claire had spent 6 years believing that her value would eventually be recognized, that patience and competence would speak louder than the need for credit or title. Tonight, between a careless insult at a dinner table and a hidden document that erased her from her own life's work, she understood with total clarity that she had been wrong. Recognition was never coming. It had never been coming. The Hartley family had built a comfortable arrangement in which Claire's labor sustained their success, while her presence remained conveniently invisible whenever visibility might have required acknowledgement, gratitude, or genuine partnership. She thought briefly about confronting Daniel directly, about waking him from his peaceful sleep and demanding an explanation for the ownership document, for the years of quiet erasure that had led to this moment. But she dismissed the idea almost as quickly as it arrived. A confrontation would accomplish nothing except giving Daniel the opportunity to explain, to apologize, to promise that things would change. Promises she had heard, in various forms, many times before across 6 years of small disappointments she had always chosen to overlook. No, Claire did not want an apology. She did not want a revised version of the ownership document with her name quietly added back in, a correction made only because she had discovered the oversight rather than because anyone had genuinely valued her enough to include her from the start. She wanted, for the first time in 6 years, to choose something entirely for herself. Claire returned to the document she had been building, the complete map of everything that existed only in her hands, and began, methodically, to think not about what she would leave behind, but about what she would take with her, and what the absence of that knowledge would mean for a company that had never bothered to learn how to survive without her. The private ledger on her personal laptop, separate from every company system, contained years of financial history that existed nowhere else in complete form. The master banking password, known only to her. The organized vendor contracts, painstakingly compiled from scattered paperwork over years. The client relationships, built through personal trust rather than formal company processes. The full details of the loan that bore her name as guarantor, a debt that legally tied her to the company's fate, whether she remained involved in its daily operations or not. She began drafting, carefully and precisely, a formal notice of resignation, not from a job she had never officially held, but from an arrangement of quiet, unacknowledged labor she was ending permanently. She drafted, alongside it, a separate letter to the bank regarding the loan she had guaranteed, requesting information on the process for formally separating her financial liability from the company should she no longer be involved in its operations. A conversation she suspected would be far more complicated than Daniel or his family currently understood. By the time the sky outside her window began to shift from black to the deep, early blue of approaching dawn, Claire had assembled everything she needed. Every password changed and recorded in a private file only she could access. Every essential document copied and secured. Every account, every relationship, every fragile thread that held the company's daily operations together, cataloged with the same careful precision she had brought to every crisis she had solved over 6 long years. She looked at the small clock on her desk, 5:15 in the morning. Daniel would wake in roughly 2 hours, unaware that the woman he had insulted at dinner, the woman he had quietly erased from an ownership document, the woman whose knowledge and labor had kept his family's business alive through crisis after crisis, was no longer the same person who had gone to sleep beside him the night before. Claire closed her laptop gently, the private ledger safely stored, and rose from her desk for the first time in nearly 5 hours. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind felt clearer than it had in years, sharpened by a night of discovery and decision rather than dulled by it. She walked quietly down the hallway toward the bedroom she still shared, for a few more hours, with a husband who had no idea what waited for him when the sun finally rose. Claire did not go back to bed. She sat instead in the kitchen, wrapped in a light cardigan against the early morning chill, watching the first pale streaks of light creep across the ceiling through the gap in the curtains. She had one more thing to do before the house woke, one call she needed to make, to the only person who had ever truly understood the quiet weight Claire carried inside this marriage. Her sister Olivia answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour, a habit built over years of practicing corporate law in a firm that rewarded lawyers who never seemed to sleep. "Claire," she said, a note of concern immediately entering her tone. "It's not even 6. What's wrong?" Claire kept her voice steady, recounting the events of the evening with the same clarity she brought to every difficult report. The comment at dinner, the laughter that followed, the ownership document she had discovered buried in the investor's due diligence folder. She spoke without embellishment, without the emotional weight the story deserved, because she needed Olivia to hear the facts clearly, not the feelings tangled around them. Olivia was quiet for a long moment after Claire finished, the kind of silence that meant careful, professional thought rather than shock. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted into the precise, measured tone she used with clients, a tone Claire had heard many times over the years but never before directed at her own situation. "Walk me through your legal standing," Olivia said. "Are you listed anywhere as an officer of the company? Any paperwork, any title, anything formal?" Claire thought carefully before answering, running through 6 years of memory. "No," she said finally, "nothing formal. I've never had an official title beyond what people called me casually. Head of finance sometimes, bookkeeper other times, nothing on paper." "And the loan?" Olivia asked. "The one you guaranteed personally 5 years ago?" "Still active," Claire said. "Still tied to my name. I checked the original documents again last night. My signature is on it as a personal guarantor, separate from any company role." Olivia exhaled slowly, and Claire could hear the sound of a pen tapping against paper on the other end of the line, a habit her sister had carried since law school. "Okay," Olivia said. "Here's what that means in practical terms. Legally, you have almost no formal claim to ownership or equity in that company, because nothing was ever documented giving you that status. But it also means the company has almost no formal claim to your continued involvement. You're not an employee under contract. You're not bound by any partnership agreement. You're a private individual who has, out of personal choice, provided labor and expertise to a business you happen to be married to." "And the loan?" Claire asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The loan is a separate legal obligation," Olivia said. "It exists independently of your marriage, independently of your involvement in the company's daily operations. You can walk away from Hartley Freight Solutions entirely tomorrow and still remain legally responsible for that guarantee unless the company either pays it off, refinances without your name attached, or you formally petition to be released from the obligation, which typically requires the lender's approval and the company's cooperation." Claire absorbed this information quietly, watching the light outside grow slightly brighter, the sky shifting from deep blue toward the soft gray of early dawn. "So I can leave," she said slowly, testing the words aloud for the first time. "But I'm still tied to their debt." "For now," Olivia said, "but listen to me carefully, Claire. If you truly are the only person who understands the company's finances the way you've described, if you're the only one with access to essential systems, essential relationships, essential knowledge, then you have far more leverage in this situation than you might realize. The loan matters, yes, and we'll address it properly. But right now, today, you have the ability to walk away and leave that company facing a crisis they have absolutely no idea how to handle." Claire was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the full weight of her sister's words. She had spent the entire night thinking about what she would take with her when she left, the knowledge, the access, the years of invisible labor no one else could replicate. She had not fully considered, until this moment, what her absence alone would actually mean for the people who had spent 6 years assuming her presence was permanent and unconditional. "What would happen," Claire asked slowly, "if I simply walked away tomorrow? No warning, no transition. What would actually happen to them?" Olivia's answer came without hesitation, the confident assessment of someone who had spent years watching businesses rise and fall based on exactly this kind of oversight. "If everything you've told me is accurate," she said, And knowing you, I believe it is, then within a matter of days, maybe 2 weeks at most, that company would face serious operational problems. Payroll could be delayed or mishandled. Vendor relationships could sour without someone managing communication and payment schedules. And if Edmund Whitmore's team is currently conducting due diligence for a major investment, any visible instability, any sign that the company's financial operations are less organized than they appeared, could seriously jeopardize that deal. Claire closed her eyes, absorbing the full shape of what her sister had just described. A company built on a foundation only she fully understood. A foundation that could crumble within days of her absence, taking with it not just daily operations, but potentially the entire investment deal Daniel had spent months courting. The same deal he had used at dinner as an excuse to humiliate her in front of the very people he was trying to impress. "I need your help," Claire said finally, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to ask. "I need to do this properly. Not out of spite, not out of anger, even though I have plenty of both right now. I need to protect myself, legally and financially, while I still can. And then I need to leave cleanly, completely, before I lose my nerve or convince myself to stay in a life that has never truly valued me." "I can help with that," Olivia said, and Claire could hear something shift in her sister's voice, professional focus mixing with quiet, fierce protectiveness. "But we need to move carefully and quickly. First, we document everything, every piece of access you hold, every account, every password, every relationship. Not to sabotage them, Claire. I want to be clear about that. Sabotage would only complicate your legal position. We document it so there's a clear, honest record of exactly what you contributed and exactly what leaves with you when you go. That protects you if this ever becomes a legal dispute." Claire nodded, though her sister could not see the gesture through the phone. "I already started that last night," she said. "A complete map of everything only I have access to." "Good," Olivia said. "Second, we need to address the loan guarantee immediately. I'll help you understand your options there, whether that means formally notifying the lender of your intent to separate from the company's operations, or beginning conversations about release from the guarantee. That process takes time, but starting it today puts you in a far stronger position than waiting. And third," Claire said quietly, finishing the thought herself, "I leave." "And third," Olivia agreed, "you leave. Cleanly. Without asking permission, without waiting for an apology that isn't coming, without giving them the chance to talk you into staying in a situation you've clearly already decided to walk away from. You've spent 6 years being the answer to every crisis in that family's life, Claire. It's time you stopped being available for that role." The call ended a few minutes later, Olivia promising to send over several documents within the hour, templates for formal notice, guidance on the loan situation, contact information for a colleague who specialized in exactly this kind of financial separation between spouses and family businesses. Claire set her phone down on the kitchen counter and sat in the quiet stillness of the early morning, the house still silent above her, Daniel still asleep, unaware that the conversation that had just taken place would determine the entire shape of the rest of his professional life. She thought briefly about the years that had led to this moment, the temporary bookkeeping job that had turned into a marriage, the marriage that had turned into 6 years of quiet, unacknowledged labor, the labor that had, just hours earlier, been formally erased from a document that would determine the ownership of everything she had built. She felt no satisfaction in what was coming, no eagerness for the disruption she was about to cause. She felt only a steady, quiet resolve, the same resolve that had carried her through every crisis she had solved for this family over the years, except this time, for the first time, that resolve was being spent entirely on herself. By the time the first true light of morning spilled across the kitchen counter, Claire had already begun, methodically and without hesitation, the careful process of separating her entire life from a company and a marriage that had never truly seen her as anything more than useful. Upstairs, Daniel stirred in his sleep, still hours away from understanding the magnitude of what was coming. Downstairs, his wife worked in silence, transforming 6 years of quiet devotion into a single, deliberate act of departure. At 6:30, Claire climbed the stairs quietly, each step familiar beneath her feet after 6 years of walking this same path, and began, for the first time, to pack a life she had never fully allowed herself to imagine leaving. She moved through the bedroom with practiced silence, careful not to wake Daniel, who slept soundly on his side of the bed, one arm thrown carelessly over the pillow where she usually rested, entirely unaware that this ordinary Tuesday morning would become the last morning of his old life. She did not pack much. A single suitcase, the same one she had used years earlier for a work conference in another city, before the company had grown large enough to require her presence at every meeting, every negotiation, every crisis. She folded clothes with mechanical efficiency, choosing practical items over sentimental ones, the woman inside her who solved problems for a living taking clear precedence over the woman who might have wanted to linger over old photographs or keepsakes from happier years. In the closet, tucked behind a row of winter coats she rarely wore, Claire found the small fireproof lockbox she had purchased years earlier, ostensibly to protect important documents from fire or theft, though she understood now, with painful clarity, that some part of her had always known she might need it for exactly this purpose. Inside, she kept copies of her own financial records, separate from the company entirely, her personal bank statements, her original signed loan guarantee documents, a handful of certificates and credentials that belonged to her alone, unconnected to Daniel or his family's business. She placed the lockbox carefully into her suitcase, along with her laptop, the private ledger stored securely within it, and a small external hard drive containing backup copies of every essential document she had compiled the previous night. She did not take anything that belonged to the company itself, no client files that were not also personal correspondence she had authored, no proprietary information beyond what already existed in her own memory and expertise. Olivia had been clear about this during their call, and Claire intended to leave with her dignity and her legal standing fully intact, taking only what was rightfully hers, her knowledge, her records, her own carefully guarded evidence of 6 years of unacknowledged work. As she moved quietly around the bedroom, Claire found herself pausing, briefly, in front of the dresser where a small collection of framed photographs sat gathering dust, moments from her marriage she had once treasured, their wedding day, a vacation to the coast, during one of the rare weeks the business had allowed them both to step away, a candid photograph Margaret had taken during a holiday dinner years earlier, before Claire had fully understood the family's true feelings about her place among them. She did not take the photographs. She looked at them for a long moment, allowing herself the brief indulgence of memory before turning away and continuing her work. Whatever these images represented, whatever version of happiness they had once captured, belonged to a chapter of her life that was closing today, and she did not need physical reminders of it to carry the lessons forward. In the small office down the hall, the room that had been hers alone for 6 years, Claire spent the longest portion of her morning. She unplugged her personal laptop, coiling the charging cable carefully around her hand before placing it in her bag. She removed a small collection of notebooks from her desk drawer, handwritten notes accumulated over years, ideas for improving the company's systems that had never been implemented, personal reflections on difficult negotiations, a private record of her own professional growth that existed nowhere else and belonged entirely to her. She looked around the office one final time, the small windowless room where she had solved crisis after crisis, saved the company from collapse more times than anyone in the Hartley family would ever fully understand, and built, quietly and without recognition, the entire financial foundation upon which their comfortable lives had rested. It was not a room anyone would miss, she realized. It was too small, too plain, too easily overlooked, much like the woman who had occupied it for 6 years, doing work that mattered enormously while remaining, to everyone around her, almost entirely invisible. She logged into the company's shared systems one final time, not to delete anything, not to sabotage anything, but simply to remove her personal access in a clean, professional manner, exactly as Olivia had advised. She changed the master banking password to a new combination she recorded securely in her personal files, intending to provide it to whoever the company eventually hired to replace her, once proper legal arrangements had been made. She did not intend to lock them out permanently or maliciously. She intended simply to stop being the invisible thread holding everything together without acknowledgement, and to ensure that whatever happened next happened through proper channels, not through her continued, unpaid, unrecognized labor. She drafted a brief, professional email to send later that morning, once she had safely left the house, addressed to Daniel, Gerald, and Margaret together, informing them formally that she was stepping away from all involvement in Hartley Freight Solutions, effective immediately, and that she had retained legal counsel to assist with the appropriate transition of financial responsibilities, including the matter of the loan she had personally guaranteed years earlier. She kept the tone measured, factual, entirely free of the anger and hurt she still carried from the previous evening. She did not need to explain her reasons in writing. The reasons were already known to everyone who had sat at that dinner table and laughed. By 7 in the morning, the house had begun to stir. Claire heard the soft creak of the bedroom door down the hall, Daniel's familiar footsteps moving toward the bathroom, the sound of running water as he began his morning routine, entirely unaware that his wife was standing in the small office upstairs, suitcase packed, ready to leave a life he had never once imagined she might choose to walk away from. She moved quickly but calmly, carrying her suitcase down the back staircase, the one rarely used, the one that led to the kitchen without passing the bathroom where Daniel currently stood, humming to himself, oblivious. In the kitchen, morning light now spilled fully across the counters, warm and golden, entirely indifferent to the enormity of what was unfolding beneath its glow. Claire set her suitcase by the back door and returned, one final time, to the small dish beside the sink where she kept her wedding ring during the mornings, a habit developed years earlier to protect the ring while washing dishes or preparing meals. She lifted the ring carefully, turning it over in her fingers, remembering briefly the young woman who had once believed this small gold band represented partnership, equality, a shared future built on mutual respect. She understood now, with the clarity that only a night of complete honesty could provide, that the ring had represented something far more one-sided than she had ever allowed herself to admit. She placed the ring gently on the kitchen counter, beside a short, handwritten note she had composed carefully in the final minutes before dawn. The note contained only 3 lines, each one chosen with the same precision she brought to every important document she had ever drafted. You called me unattractive at your table. I have spent 6 years being everything this family needed and receiving nothing in return but convenience. I am done. She did not sign it. There was no need. Daniel would know exactly whose words these were the moment he read them, and exactly why they had been written. Claire stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of the house around her, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the distant creak of pipes as Daniel's shower continued upstairs, the gentle morning birdsong drifting through the window above the sink. This house had never truly felt like hers, she realized, standing here for what she understood would be the final time. It had always felt like Daniel's house, the Hartley family's house, a space she occupied but never fully belonged to, much like the company she had spent 6 years sustaining without ever holding a genuine claim to its ownership or success. She picked up her suitcase, feeling its weight settle familiarly against her palm, and walked toward the back door, pausing only briefly to glance around the kitchen one final time, memorizing details she suspected she would carry with her regardless of whether she wanted to. The small chip in the tile near the stove, the window that never quite closed properly, the quiet, ordinary details of a life she was choosing, deliberately and finally, to leave behind. Outside, the morning air felt crisp and clean against her skin, carrying the particular freshness of early summer before the day's heat had fully settled in. Claire loaded her suitcase into the trunk of her car, the same reliable sedan she had purchased years earlier with money she had personally earned, separate from any company funds, a small but meaningful detail she found herself grateful for in this moment. Whatever else had been taken from her, Whatever recognition had been withheld, this car, at least, belonged entirely to her. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine, watching the house through the windshield, the familiar shape of the roofline against the brightening sky, the curtained windows that had, for 6 years, framed the quiet architecture of her daily life. She felt no dramatic surge of emotion in this moment, no tears, no trembling hands. She felt only the same steady clarity that had guided her through the entire night, a clarity born not from anger, though anger had certainly played its part, but from a simple, undeniable recognition that she deserved more than the life this house represented. As she pulled out of the driveway, the early morning sun catching the edges of the sky in soft gold and pink, Claire glanced once, briefly, in her rearview mirror. She saw the house grow smaller behind her, the place where she had spent 6 years building something remarkable that had never once been credited to her name, and she felt, for the first time since the previous night's dinner, something that resembled peace. Behind her, inside the house she had just left, Daniel finished his shower, dried himself off, and walked toward the kitchen for his usual cup of coffee, entirely unaware that the woman who had quietly sustained his entire world was already miles away, her personal ledger secured beside her, her decision made, her future finally, completely, her own to shape. The sun continued its slow climb into the sky, indifferent to the quiet revolution that had unfolded within a single house over a single night. Somewhere in the city ahead, a small apartment Claire had arranged weeks earlier, almost as though some part of her had anticipated this exact moment long before she consciously understood why, waited to become the first home she had ever chosen entirely for herself. She drove without music, without conversation, simply allowing herself to exist in the quiet, unfamiliar sensation of complete autonomy, a feeling she had not experienced in longer than she could clearly remember. Behind her, a marriage was ending. Behind her, a company built on foundations only she fully understood was about to face a crisis it had no idea how to survive. And ahead of her, though she did not yet know the full shape of what waited, Claire Whitfield drove steadily forward into a life that finally, completely, belonged to her alone. Daniel found the note a little after 8 that morning, standing in the kitchen with a mug of coffee in his hand, still humming the same tune he had hummed the night before, still entirely unaware that anything in his life had changed. He noticed the ring first, sitting alone in the small dish by the sink where it usually rested during the day, and for a brief, confused moment, he assumed Claire had simply forgotten to put it back on before leaving early for some errand. Then he saw the note beneath it, 3 short lines written in Claire's precise, familiar handwriting, and the mug slipped from his fingers, shattering against the tile floor, hot coffee spreading in a dark stain across the pale stone. He read the note 4 times before the words fully registered, his mind struggling to reconcile the calm, measured woman he had known for 6 years with the finality of what she had written. "You called me unattractive at your table." He remembered the joke immediately, remembered the laughter it had earned from Edmund Whitmore and his own parents, and felt, for the first time, a genuine flicker of understanding about how those words might have landed on the other side of the table. He called her phone immediately, his hands trembling slightly as he dialed, but the call went straight to voicemail, Claire's calm, professional voice instructing callers to leave a message, a voice that suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. He tried again, and again, each attempt met with the same flat, automated silence. By 9 that morning, Daniel had arrived at the office, still shaken, still uncertain how serious the situation truly was, and attempted to log into the company's banking portal to review the morning's transactions, a routine task he had watched Claire perform countless times but had never once needed to do himself. The password did not work. He tried again, certain he had simply mistyped it, but the system locked him out after 3 failed attempts, requiring a security verification he had no idea how to complete. He called the company's payroll processor next, only to be informed that the scheduled payroll run for that week required authorization from an account administrator, a role currently listed under Claire's name and credentials, and that without her explicit approval, Payments to the company's 37 employees would be delayed. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen, a cold, creeping panic beginning to settle in his chest as he realized, slowly and painfully, just how completely his family's business had depended on a woman he had spent years failing to fully appreciate. He called his father next, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety, explaining as calmly as he could manage that Claire had left, that she had taken something, some kind of access or password, and that the company's basic financial operations appeared to be frozen. Gerald, initially dismissive, assured his son that this was surely a simple misunderstanding, that Claire would return once emotions had cooled, that these things always sorted themselves out eventually. The same confident, careless optimism that had nearly destroyed the company years before Claire had ever walked through its doors. By that afternoon, Gerald's confidence had begun to waver. He had personally attempted to contact 3 of the company's largest vendors, hoping to confirm payment schedules and maintain smooth operations while the banking issue was resolved, only to discover that he did not actually know which vendors were owed what amounts, did not know the terms of their current contracts, did not know, in any practical sense, how the company's day-to-day financial obligations actually functioned. He had built this business 20 years earlier, but somewhere along the way, without ever fully realizing it, he had allowed its entire operational memory to reside in the mind of a woman he had always considered, at best, a helpful addition to the family rather than an essential architect of its survival. Margaret arrived at the office late that afternoon, having heard the escalating panic secondhand through a series of increasingly frantic phone calls, and found her husband and son sitting together in Daniel's office, surrounded by scattered papers neither of them fully understood, attempting to reconstruct, from memory and guesswork, a financial system that had taken Claire 6 years to build and refine. "Someone must know the passwords," Margaret said, her voice tight with the particular frustration of someone who had never once needed to understand technical details because someone else had always handled them. "Call the bank, explain the situation. Surely they can help." The bank, when finally reached, explained politely but firmly that account access could only be restored through proper verification channels, a process that would require several business days given the security protocols currently in place. Protocols Claire herself had specifically requested and implemented 2 years earlier after the security scare that had prompted her to strengthen the company's financial protections. The very system she had built to protect the company from external threats now stood, ironically and completely by her design, as an immovable barrier against the family's attempts to regain control without her cooperation. By evening, word of the crisis had reached beyond the immediate family. A vendor representative called, politely but pointedly inquiring about an overdue payment that Daniel had no idea was even due, information that existed only in a spreadsheet on Claire's personal laptop, now presumably wherever Claire herself currently was. A client, one of the relationships Claire had personally cultivated over years of careful, consistent communication, sent an email expressing confusion about a shipment schedule that had apparently gone unanswered for the first time in years, unaware that the woman who typically handled such correspondence was no longer checking that particular inbox. Daniel sat alone in his office long after his parents had finally gone home, staring at a company he suddenly understood he barely knew how to operate, despite having spent years believing himself to be its capable, confident leader. He thought about the dinner the previous night, about the careless words that had slipped so easily from his mouth, words he had not even considered particularly cruel at the time, simply a comfortable joke shared among family and a potential business partner, the kind of easy humor he had used 100 times before without consequence. He understood now, sitting alone in the growing darkness of his office, exactly what that joke had cost him. Not simply his marriage, though that loss alone felt enormous and disorienting. He understood that he had cost himself, through years of careless assumption and casual disregard, the entire quiet foundation upon which his family's success had always rested. The following morning brought worse news. Edmund Whitmore's assistant called, requesting an updated financial report ahead of a scheduled due diligence meeting, a report that Claire had always prepared personally, drawing on financial systems only she fully understood how to navigate. Daniel attempted to explain, vaguely, that there had been a small administrative delay, that the report would be ready shortly, buying time he desperately needed but had no clear plan for using effectively. He hired, in a moment of increasing desperation, a temporary bookkeeper recommended by a business associate, hoping to quickly reconstruct at least a partial understanding of the company's current financial position. The bookkeeper, a competent professional named Grace Ellison, arrived the following day and spent nearly 6 hours attempting to make sense of the company's records, only to conclude, with visible frustration, that significant portions of the financial history existed nowhere in the company's official systems. That critical context and institutional knowledge appeared to be missing entirely, scattered across relationships and understandings that had clearly existed only in one person's memory. "Whoever was managing your books before," Grace said carefully, choosing her words with the diplomatic caution of someone unwilling to openly criticize a client's family situation, "was doing considerably more than basic bookkeeping. This looks like the work of someone functioning as a full financial controller, possibly even acting as an unofficial chief financial officer. Reconstructing this level of institutional knowledge is going to take significant time, and I have to be honest with you, some of it may simply be unrecoverable without that person's direct cooperation." Daniel absorbed this assessment in silence, the full weight of Claire's absence settling over him with increasing, suffocating clarity. He thought about the countless times he had introduced her, casually, as the person who handles the books, a description that suddenly felt almost insultingly small compared to the reality Grace Ellison had just described, a reality he himself had somehow never fully grasped despite living alongside it for 6 years. Gerald, visiting the office later that week, found his son sitting amid a growing pile of unresolved problems, unpaid invoices requiring context only Claire possessed, client inquiries requiring relationships only Claire had built, an investor deal hanging precariously in the balance because the polished, organized company Edmund Whitmore had originally agreed to invest in now appeared, upon closer inspection, considerably less organized than anyone had realized. "We underestimated her," Gerald said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something, a man unaccustomed to acknowledging mistakes, particularly regarding decisions he had made or failed to make over many years. "All of us did. Your mother, myself, you most of all. We treated her like she was simply helping out, doing us a favor, when in reality she was the only reason any of this," he gestured broadly around the office, "has survived this long." Daniel did not respond immediately, staring instead at a stack of unresolved paperwork on his desk, documents Claire would have handled effortlessly, documents that now sat as physical evidence of everything he had failed to appreciate until it was far too late to matter. "I need to talk to her," Daniel said finally, his voice carrying a note of genuine desperation that had not been present at the dinner table 2 nights earlier. "I need to explain, apologize, ask her to come back. We can fix this. We can figure out the right title, the right compensation, whatever she needs." Gerald looked at his son with an expression that mixed sympathy and hard, practical realism in equal measure. "Son," he said quietly, "I don't think Claire left because she wanted a better title. I think she left because we spent 6 years treating her like she didn't deserve one. And by the time we finally noticed, it was already far too late for an apology to undo that kind of damage." Daniel sat quietly with his father's words, the truth of them settling uncomfortably into a space he had spent years avoiding examining too closely. Outside his office window, the ordinary sounds of the business continued, phones ringing with problems no one currently knew how to solve, employees moving through hallways with the same uncertain confusion that had gripped the entire company since Claire's departure 2 days earlier. He picked up his phone and called her number one more time, listening to the same calm, professional voicemail greeting, and this time, instead of hanging up in frustrated silence, he left a message, his voice unsteady in a way that felt entirely foreign to the confident, charming man who had once so easily commanded a dinner table. "Claire," he said quietly into the phone, "I know I don't deserve to ask this, but please call me back. I understand now, more than I ever have, exactly what you did for this company for me. I was wrong about all of it. I'm sorry." He set the phone down and waited, though some quiet, honest part of him already suspected that this apology, arriving only after the full weight of consequence had finally forced him to understand what he had lost, had come far too late to change anything at all. A week passed with no response from Claire, and Daniel's desperation slowly hardened into something closer to anger, a familiar emotional shelter he had always retreated to whenever genuine vulnerability became too uncomfortable to sustain. He met with the company's longtime attorney, a cautious, methodical man named Arthur Bellwether, hoping to find some legal pathway that might force Claire's cooperation, or at the very least, force the return of information he had come to believe belonged rightfully to the company. Arthur listened patiently as Daniel explained the situation, the missing passwords, the frozen banking access, the client relationships that had gone quiet, the payroll delays that had already caused 2 employees to formally raise concerns with a labor board. When Daniel finally finished, Arthur removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly with a cloth from his pocket, and delivered his assessment with the careful precision of a man who had seen this exact situation unfold many times before, in many different families, always with the same painful outcome. "Was Claire ever formally employed by Hartley Freight Solutions?" Arthur asked. "A signed employment contract, a defined salary structure, tax documents listing her as staff?" Daniel hesitated, already sensing where this question was leading. "No," he admitted. "She never took a formal salary. We always considered it part of how the family operated. She managed the finances because it made sense for her too, given her background and her role in the family." Arthur nodded slowly, unsurprised by the answer. "Then legally," he said, "Claire was never an employee of this company. She was a spouse who voluntarily contributed labor and expertise, without formal compensation, without a binding agreement, and crucially, without any documented obligation requiring her continued involvement or the return of information she personally developed and maintained." "But the passwords," Daniel said, his frustration rising. "The systems, all of it belongs to the company. She can't just take that and walk away." "The systems themselves belong to the company," Arthur agreed carefully. "The banking accounts, the payroll platform, the physical infrastructure, all of that remains the company's legal property, and the bank will restore your access once you complete their standard verification process, which, as I understand it, is already underway. What Claire cannot be legally compelled to return is the knowledge itself, the institutional understanding of how those systems function, the relationships she personally built with clients and vendors, the years of accumulated expertise that exist in her mind rather than in any document owned by the company." Daniel sat back in his chair, absorbing this distinction with growing frustration. "So she can just walk away with 6 years of critical knowledge, and there's nothing we can do about it." "You could potentially pursue legal action," Arthur said carefully, "though I would strongly advise against it, and not simply for strategic reasons. Any legal challenge would require demonstrating that Claire owed the company a formal duty she failed to uphold, and given the complete absence of any employment contract, partnership agreement, or defined role, that argument would be exceedingly difficult to establish. Furthermore, any legal action would almost certainly require disclosing, in detail, the full extent of her actual contributions to the company over the past 6 years, information that could become part of the public record during litigation." Daniel frowned, not immediately understanding the implication. Arthur continued patiently, the tone of a man explaining a difficult truth to someone not yet ready to hear it. "If this matter proceeded to litigation," Arthur said, "and Claire's legal representation presented evidence of her actual role, the loan she personally guaranteed, the crises she personally resolved, the complete absence of formal compensation or recognition despite functioning. By all accounts, as the company's de facto financial controller, the resulting narrative would not reflect well on this family or this business. Any potential legal victory regarding proprietary information would likely be overshadowed by public perception of how this company treated the person actually responsible for its survival. Daniel absorbed this in silence, understanding, slowly and uncomfortably, that pursuing Claire legally would not simply fail to solve his immediate problems. It would actively make everything worse, exposing the very dynamic that had driven her away in the first place to public scrutiny, potentially damaging the company's reputation among clients, vendors, and investors far more severely than her absence alone already had. "There is a separate matter requiring more immediate attention," Arthur added, shifting the conversation toward more urgent practical concerns. "I understand from your father that Claire personally guaranteed a significant loan 5 years ago, a debt that remains legally tied to her name regardless of her current involvement with the company." Daniel nodded slowly, having nearly forgotten in the chaos of the past week the full weight of that particular detail. "You should expect," Arthur continued, "that Claire's legal counsel will likely initiate formal proceedings to separate her from that guarantee, either by requiring the company to refinance the debt without her name attached, or by pursuing other legal remedies to limit her ongoing liability. This process will require the company's full cooperation, and frankly, given the circumstances, I would strongly advise providing that cooperation promptly and without resistance. Contesting her attempt to separate from that obligation would only invite further scrutiny of exactly the kind of situation I've already described." Daniel left Arthur's office that afternoon with a headache building steadily behind his eyes, the full legal reality of his situation settling into an uncomfortable, undeniable clarity. He had spent the past week hoping, somewhere beneath his anger and desperation, that some legal mechanism existed to force Claire's return, to compel the restoration of everything that had disappeared alongside her departure. Arthur's careful, methodical explanation had eliminated that hope entirely, replacing it with the harder, more painful understanding that Claire's departure had been not just emotionally devastating, but legally unassailable. A clean, deliberate exit executed by someone who had clearly understood her position far more precisely than Daniel had ever bothered to consider. The investor situation deteriorated further over the following days. Edmund Whitmore, sensing the company's growing instability through a combination of delayed reports, inconsistent communication, and a noticeable shift in Daniel's usual confident demeanor, requested an in-person meeting to discuss his continued interest in the deal. Daniel arrived at the meeting with Gerald beside him, both men attempting to project a confidence neither genuinely felt, and spent nearly 2 hours fielding increasingly pointed questions about the company's financial organization, questions neither of them could answer with the precision Claire had always brought effortlessly to similar conversations. "I have to be candid with you," Edmund said near the end of the meeting, his tone carrying the measured caution of an experienced investor who had learned, over many years, to recognize the early signs of instability before they became catastrophic. "The reports I've received over the past 2 weeks have raised concerns about the organization and reliability of your financial operations. I understood from our previous meetings that this was one of the company's genuine strengths." "It was," Daniel said quietly, the admission costing him something significant. "It still is, in terms of the underlying business. We're working through some transitional challenges with our financial management structure." Edmund studied him carefully, an experienced businessman reading between the lines of a carefully worded evasion. "Mrs. Hartley managed those operations, if I recall correctly," he said. "The woman I spoke with briefly at dinner, is she no longer involved with the company?" Daniel hesitated, and in that hesitation, Edmund found his answer clearly enough without requiring further explanation. "I'll need some time to reconsider our position," Edmund said finally, rising from his chair, his tone polite but unmistakably final. A strong investment requires confidence in operational stability, and right now, based on what I'm observing, that confidence has been shaken. I wish you the best in resolving these challenges, but I don't feel comfortable proceeding further until they're fully addressed. The deal, which had once represented the culmination of months of careful courting and negotiation, effectively collapsed within that single conversation. Taking with it the financial security Daniel had hoped might finally stabilize the company for good. Driving home that evening, Daniel found himself thinking with painful clarity about the exact words he had spoken at that same dinner table 2 weeks earlier. The careless joke about Claire's appearance that had seemed, at the time, like nothing more than harmless charm designed to impress a potential investor. He understood now, with the full weight of consequence finally settling over him, that those words had cost him considerably more than a single evening's discomfort. They had cost him his marriage, his company's operational foundation, and now, apparently, the very investment deal he had been attempting to secure when he uttered them in the first place. He thought about calling Claire again, leaving another message she would likely never return, but something in him understood, finally and completely, that further apologies delivered only after consequences had forced their arrival would accomplish nothing except confirming exactly what she had already concluded about his character, that his regard for her had always existed in direct proportion to her usefulness, appearing only when her absence became inconvenient, rather than when her presence had once been genuinely valued. He did not call. Instead, he sat alone in his car outside the house that no longer felt entirely like home, watching the evening light fade slowly across the quiet street, understanding, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, the true and painful cost of having spent 6 years failing to see clearly the person who had made his entire comfortable existence possible. 3 months after leaving the house on that quiet suburban street, Claire Whitfield sat in a small, sunlit office she had rented on the second floor of a converted brick building downtown, reviewing a stack of financial documents spread across a wide oak desk she had purchased entirely with her own money. The office was modest, far smaller than the corporate headquarters of Hartley Freight Solutions, but every detail within it, the desk, the certifications framed neatly on the wall, the small brass nameplate reading Whitfield Financial Consulting beside the door, belonged entirely to her, built from nothing but her own reputation and expertise. The transition had not been easy. Legal separation from the loan she had personally guaranteed years earlier had taken careful, patient negotiation, guided by Olivia and a colleague who specialized in exactly this kind of complicated financial untangling. Hartley Freight Solutions had ultimately been required to refinance the debt independently, a process that revealed, in painful detail during the necessary financial disclosures, exactly how precarious the company's finances had actually become in the weeks following Claire's departure. She had felt no satisfaction watching that process unfold, only a quiet, steady relief at finally severing a legal obligation that had tied her, invisibly, to a family and a business that had never truly valued her contribution. The divorce proceedings had moved with surprising speed, both parties choosing, ultimately, to avoid the prolonged, public conflict that contested litigation might have invited. Daniel had not fought her on the terms, a decision Claire suspected had less to do with genuine remorse than with Arthur Bellwether's careful counsel regarding the reputational risks of exposing the true nature of their marriage's imbalance to public scrutiny. She did not need his remorse to move forward. She needed only her freedom, and by early autumn she had it, fully and legally, without further complication. Word of Claire's departure and subsequent independence had traveled, as these things often do, through the quiet channels of a business community that paid closer attention to reputation and reliability than most people realized. Clients she had personally cultivated over her years at Hartley Freight Solutions, vendors who had come to trust her direct, honest communication style, colleagues who had crossed paths with her during negotiations and crisis management over the years. Several of them began reaching out independently, first with cautious inquiries about her availability, and later with genuine offers of work. Claire built her consulting practice slowly and deliberately, applying the same careful, methodical discipline she had once brought to rescuing a struggling freight company from collapse. Except now, every hour of work she invested carried her own name, her own reputation, her own genuine ownership stake in whatever success followed. She specialized in exactly the kind of complicated financial restructuring she had once performed invisibly for Daniel's family. Except now, clients understood clearly and explicitly the value of what she provided, compensating her accordingly with contracts that reflected her actual expertise, rather than the vague, undefined arrangement she had once accepted as simply part of being family. On a bright afternoon in early October, Claire received a phone call that would mark a meaningful turning point in her new independent life. The caller identified himself as Nathan Cole, a business consultant who explained, with evident warmth in his voice, that he had been present at a dinner several months earlier, seated beside Edmund Whitmore, the evening Daniel Hartley had made his careless comment about his wife's appearance. "I've thought about that evening more than a few times since," Nathan said candidly, once Claire had settled into the conversation, curious but cautious about where it might be heading. Not because of the comment itself, though I'll admit it left an unpleasant impression on everyone at that table. I've thought about it because of what happened afterward, when Edmund asked you directly about your role in the company. I remember watching you answer, calm and completely clear, while the rest of the table sat there looking faintly embarrassed, and I remember thinking, quite plainly, that you were without question the most capable person sitting at that table that evening. Claire listened quietly, a small, genuine smile forming despite herself, an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her at hearing, finally and directly, an observation she had long suspected, but had rarely heard spoken aloud by anyone outside her own private thoughts. I run a consulting firm that works with mid-sized logistics and distribution companies, Nathan continued, helping them prepare for exactly the kind of investment scrutiny you clearly understand better than most financial professionals I've worked with over the years. I heard, through mutual connections, that you had started your own practice, and I wanted to reach out personally to see whether you might be interested in a collaboration. I have 3 clients right now who could genuinely benefit from the kind of financial restructuring expertise you demonstrated, quite unforgettably, at that dinner. Claire considered the offer carefully, though she already understood, somewhere beneath her careful professional consideration, that this represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had been quietly building toward since the morning she had driven away from the only life she had known for 6 years. "I'd be interested in discussing it further," she said, her voice steady and confident in a way that felt entirely natural now, rather than something she had to consciously construct. "Though I should mention, I intend to be quite clear about compensation and formal agreements from the very beginning of any collaboration." Nathan laughed warmly on the other end of the line. "Given what I understand about your previous professional situation," he said, "I would expect nothing less, and frankly, I'd be somewhat concerned if you approached this any other way." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering details of potential clients, discussing Claire's approach to financial restructuring, her methods for identifying and resolving operational inefficiencies before they became genuine crises. By the end of the call, Nathan had extended a formal proposal for an ongoing consulting partnership, one that included not just individual client referrals, but a genuine equity stake in a joint venture they would build together, combining his network of business relationships with her demonstrated financial expertise. Claire accepted the proposal 2 weeks later, following careful review with Olivia to ensure every term reflected her actual value and protected her interests fully, a level of formal, documented clarity she had never once experienced during 6 years at Hartley Freight Solutions. The partnership grew steadily over the following months, Claire's reputation for meticulous, honest financial work spreading naturally through the same quiet professional channels that had once carried whispers of her departure from Daniel's company. By early winter, Whitfield Financial Consulting, now formally partnered with Nathan Cole's established firm, had taken on 11 active clients, ranging from small family businesses facing exactly the kind of quiet financial crisis Claire had once resolved invisibly for years, to larger regional companies seeking careful preparation ahead of significant investment opportunities. Claire found herself, for the first time in her professional life, receiving genuine recognition for her work, her name appearing directly on reports, her expertise credited explicitly in client meetings, her contributions acknowledged not as a favor generously extended by someone more important, but as the genuine, valuable expertise it had always actually been. She thought occasionally about the small windowless office at Hartley Freight Solutions, where she had once spent countless hours solving crisis after crisis in near total silence, and she felt, surprisingly, very little bitterness toward that chapter of her life. It had taught her, after all, everything she now understood about financial restructuring, crisis management, and the patient, careful work of rebuilding struggling businesses from the inside out. What she felt instead, when those memories surfaced, was a quiet, steady gratitude that she had finally, decisively, chosen to walk away before that invisible labor consumed the entirety of her professional life, without ever once being properly acknowledged. On a cold evening in late November, Claire attended a business networking event downtown, invited by Nathan to help introduce Whitfield Financial Consulting to a wider circle of potential clients within the local business community. She moved through the crowded room with quiet confidence, engaging in conversations about financial strategy and business growth with professionals who listened to her insights with genuine respect and interest. A stark, welcome contrast to years of being spoken over or around at family dinners. Near the end of the evening, as the crowd began gradually thinning, Nathan approached her with a warm smile, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water, and handed one to Claire as he settled beside her near a window overlooking the quiet city street below. "You know," he said, watching the scattered lights of the city reflect softly against the glass, "I've worked with a great many talented financial professionals over the years, but very few who combine your particular level of technical precision with genuine, patient understanding of how struggling businesses actually function under pressure. That combination is rare, Claire, genuinely rare." Claire smiled, holding her glass loosely, feeling in this quiet moment the full and satisfying weight of everything she had rebuilt since that painful dinner months earlier. "I spent 6 years developing that combination," she said, "without anyone around me fully understanding what they were watching." "Well," Nathan said, raising his glass slightly in a small, genuine toast, "I always thought you were the smartest person at that table. I'm glad the rest of the world is finally starting to notice what I saw immediately." Claire touched her glass gently against his, the soft clink barely audible over the quiet hum of conversation around them, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, the simple, satisfying sensation of being exactly where she belonged, seated not at the edge of someone else's table, cropped quietly out of the photograph, but firmly and permanently at the center of a life she had built entirely, deliberately, and successfully for herself. Outside, the city continued its steady evening rhythm, indifferent to the quiet triumph unfolding within the warm, well-lit room above its streets. But inside, Claire Whitfield understood, with complete and unshakable clarity, that the woman who had once been dismissed so carelessly across a dinner table had finally, fully, become impossible to overlook. A year and a half after that quiet November evening, Whitfield Financial Consulting had grown into one of the more respected boutique advisory firms in the region, known specifically for guiding mid-sized companies through the delicate, high-stakes process of investor due diligence. Claire had hired 2 junior associates by then, both women she had specifically sought out after recognizing in their resumes the same quiet, overlooked competence she herself had once carried through years of unrecognized labor. She trained them differently than she herself had ever been trained, insisting from their very first day that every contribution be documented, credited, and properly compensated, a policy she enforced not out of sentiment, but out of hard-earned understanding of exactly what happens when brilliant work goes unacknowledged for too long. Her relationship with Olivia had deepened during this period into something even closer than the sisterly bond they had always shared. The two of them meeting regularly for dinner, no longer discussing crisis and legal strategy, but simply enjoying the easy, comfortable companionship of two women who had weathered a difficult transition together and emerged, on the other side, stronger and more confident than before. Olivia often joked that Claire's departure from Hartley Freight Solutions had become something of a case study among her colleagues, a quiet, cautionary example whispered among attorneys who specialized in exactly this kind of family business dispute. Proof of what happens when a company mistakes convenience for security, when an entire operational foundation rests, unacknowledged, upon a single overlooked person. Claire heard news of Hartley Freight Solutions only occasionally after that, filtered through the same quiet professional channels that carried most business news through the local community. She learned that Gerald had eventually stepped back into a more active daily role, unable to fully retire as he had once planned, needing to personally oversee operations that had grown considerably more fragile in Claire's absence. She learned that the company had hired, and subsequently lost, 3 different financial managers over the following year, each one struggling in different ways to reconstruct the kind of comprehensive institutional knowledge Claire had built patiently over 6 years. Knowledge that could not simply be transferred through handover documents or brief training sessions. She learned, though this news arrived somewhat later and through a more circuitous path, that Daniel had eventually sold a significant portion of his ownership stake to a private investment group, a decision made necessary by the company's ongoing financial instability, a decision that effectively ended the Hartley family's complete control over a business Gerald had built from nothing more than a single delivery truck decades earlier. Claire felt, upon hearing this news, not satisfaction exactly, but a quiet, sober recognition of consequence, the natural and inevitable result of years spent undervaluing the very foundation that had kept the company standing. She encountered Daniel only once during this period, entirely by accident, at a professional conference neither of them had expected the other to attend. She saw him first from across the crowded conference hall, noticeably thinner, noticeably more subdued than the confident, charming man she remembered from her old life, and she felt, watching him from a distance, a strange, complicated mixture of emotions she had not fully anticipated, not lingering anger, not quite sympathy, but something closer to simple, quiet closure, the sensation of observing a chapter of her life that had, at some point without her fully noticing, finally and completely finished healing. Daniel noticed her as well, their eyes meeting briefly across the room, and after a moment's visible hesitation he approached her carefully, his posture uncertain in a way she had never once seen from him during their marriage. "Claire," he said quietly, once he had crossed the room to stand a respectful distance away. "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you," she replied evenly, her tone polite but carrying none of the old familiarity that had once colored every conversation between them. "You look well," he said, and then, after a brief pause that suggested genuine uncertainty about whether he had any right to continue, he added, "I heard about your firm. It sounds like you've built something impressive." "I have," Claire said simply, offering no further elaboration, no invitation for the conversation to deepen into anything more personal than polite professional acknowledgement. Daniel nodded slowly, seeming to understand, finally and completely, that whatever bridge might have once existed between them had long since been dismantled, not through anger or bitterness, but through the simple, steady passage of time and the natural consequences of choices made years earlier. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "a real one, not the kind I offered back when I was simply panicking about the company falling apart. I understand now, more clearly than I did then, exactly what I took for granted for far too long." Claire studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the old resentment she had once carried so heavily, and found, to her genuine surprise, very little remaining. "I accept your apology," she said finally, her voice calm and steady. "But I want you to understand something clearly. I didn't leave because I wanted an apology, Daniel. I left because I finally understood my own worth, and once I understood it, staying in a situation that refused to recognize it simply stopped being possible. Daniel nodded again, absorbing her words with visible, genuine reflection. I understand that now, he said. It took losing nearly everything to understand it, but I do understand it. They parted shortly afterward, without further conversation, without exchanging contact information, both of them recognizing, without needing to say so explicitly, that this brief, civil exchange represented a genuine and complete conclusion to a chapter neither of them needed to revisit further. Claire returned to her own conference session moments later, greeting colleagues and clients with the same warm, confident professionalism she had cultivated over the past 2 years, carrying with her only the quiet, settled satisfaction of a woman who had faced her past directly and found, within herself, nothing left to fear from it. That evening, driving home from the conference through familiar city streets now filled with genuine, personal meaning rather than borrowed obligation, Claire allowed herself to reflect fully on the journey that had carried her from a humiliating dinner table to the confident, accomplished life she now inhabited. She thought about the frightened, uncertain woman who had once cropped herself quietly out of family photographs, who had accepted 6 years of unacknowledged labor believing, mistakenly, that patience alone would eventually earn recognition. She thought about the long, sleepless night that had followed one careless comment, the methodical, clear-eyed decision-making that had carried her through packing a single suitcase before dawn, the difficult early months of rebuilding a professional identity entirely from scratch, without the safety net of a marriage or a family name to fall back upon. She thought, most of all, about the moment Nathan Cole had told her, simply and honestly, that she had always been the smartest person at that table, a truth she had known privately for years, but had never once heard spoken aloud by anyone who genuinely meant it. That single moment of recognition, arriving finally after years of quiet, patient invisibility, had confirmed something she now understood with complete and unshakable certainty, that her worth had never actually depended on anyone else's willingness to acknowledge it, that the recognition she had once desperately hoped to earn through patient sacrifice was, in truth, something she had needed to claim for herself all along. Claire pulled into the small, well-lit parking area outside her office building, the brass nameplate beside the door catching the evening light softly as she walked past it. Whitfield Financial Consulting, a name that belonged entirely to her, built through her own effort, sustained through her own expertise, recognized now, finally and completely, on her own terms rather than anyone else's. She thought, one final time, about that painful dinner months earlier, the careless comment that had once felt like the cruelest moment of her adult life, and she understood now, with the clarity that only genuine distance and hard-won success could provide, that it had also, quietly and unexpectedly, become the exact moment her real life had finally begun. Not the life defined by someone else's comfortable convenience, but the life she had built entirely for herself, deliberate, hard-earned, and completely, unshakably her own. The city lights glowed steadily around her as she climbed the stairs toward her office one final time that evening, not to work, but simply to sit for a quiet moment at the desk she had built her new life around, surrounded by the tangible proof of everything she had accomplished since the morning she had packed a single suitcase and driven away from a life that had never truly seen her. She understood now, completely and without doubt, that she had not simply survived that painful chapter of her life. She had transformed it, deliberately and completely, into the very foundation of everything that came after. Proof that even the most careless words, spoken thoughtlessly across a dinner table, could become, in the right hands, the beginning of an entirely different and far more genuine kind of story.